Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the different sizes of games for Warhammer 40K 9th edition. And within those different sizes of games I'm going to be coming up with a few sample example lists for my 1000 Suns. This is a great way for those of you that are slow growing an army and looking to build up a collection as well. So the first thing we want to look at are the different combat sizes. So they all have a fancy name: Combat Patrol, Incursion, Strikeforce and Onslaught. And that is going to be played between 1, 2, 3 and higher hours. That is the recommended game time. We also have a different power level, points limit and command points allocated to your armies based on those battle sizes. So as you can see from in front of you now, the Combat Patrol is a total power level of 50 up to 500 points, and you get 3 command points per player. Now that 50 power level, and in fact all the power levels, is supposed to be split between both players. So yeah, 25 power level each. That's quite difficult to actually achieve, and I believe they are rebalancing power levels in 9th edition. So I have included power levels in my sample army list, and you'll notice they are above the recommended size, but they are below the recommended points limit. But although power level is supposed to be split between both players, the points limit is per player and the command points are per player. But I kind of looked more at the points limit because I kind of felt that more people play to the points limit than necessarily the power level. Moving then into Incursion, this is our 51 to 100 power level, 501 to 1000 points, and each player gets 6 command points. Moving on to probably the most common size of game then is called Strikeforce, 101 to 200 power level, 1001 to 2000 points with 12 command points. And finally, those larger games, Onslaught, 201 to 300 power, and a points limit of 2001 to 3000 points with 18 command points. With each size of game, we get a different number of maximum detachments we are allowed to take. So for Combat Patrol, we are only allowed 1 detachment, and in fact that is fixed as well. We can only take the Combat Patrol detachment. For Incursion game sizes, we can take 2 detachments, Strikeforce 3 and Onslaught 4. Now over the years I've collected quite a sizable collection of 1000 Suns, and you can see that picture on the screen in front of you. It's around about 4000 points as of 8th edition. I suspect that is now going to be a little bit higher, maybe 4300 points in 9th edition. But what that means is, as a collector, no matter what edition, no matter how the meta changes, or what becomes in and out of favour, I've probably got a unit that I can use in any of the games across any edition. There are a few units in here that I would love to have. I'd love to have a Defiler, I'd love to have maybe some Hellbrutes or some Contemptor Dreadnoughts. Maybe watch this channel for the future and something like that may suddenly appear. But where my collection I feel does excel is in those foot troops. So I've got 40 Rubric Marines, 15 Scarab Occult, just over 20 Zangor on foot. Then I've got both variants of Enlightened. I've got the Zangor Shaman, I've got a few Cultists in there. I've got a plethora of different characters from Araman all the way up to the big man himself, Magnus. And 6 aspiring, or 6 sorcerers, whether you have them as aspiring, exalted, or on foot, or on disc. I've got all of those. A couple of spawn, and then some varying vehicles, some Decimator engines, the Mutalith Vortex Beast, the Forge Fiend, the Helldrake, and 3 winged Demon Princes. So I've got pretty much everything that I feel can still hold its own in the new edition. Now, obviously, without some of those other units that I've just mentioned that I don't have, feel free to look at the list that I've got, and I'll maybe suggest some substitutions at some point if you do have some slightly different models that you want to fit in, or you're looking as part of your slow grow as an idea and you think maybe I'm a little bit off and I should find an alternative to a particular model, then I'll put that in the suggestion as we go through the video. So starting at the smallest game size then, the Combat Patrol, we are only allowed to take the Patrol Detachment. And all units must be from the same faction, cannot include any understrength units. It costs 2 command points, but those are refunded if your Warlord is part of that detachment. Obviously, with only 1 detachment, your Warlord must be part of that detachment. So you'll still start with your 3 command points. We're allowed 1 to 2 HQs, 1 to 3 troops, 0 to 2 elite, 0 to 2 fast attack, 0 to 2 heavy support, and 0 to 2 flyers, with a mandatory choice here of just 1 HQ and 1 troops choice. And if in general you're new to Warhammer 40k, The mandatory things, which are in red on the little boxes there, means that to be a valid detachment, you must have that 1 HQ and 1 troop. So that's why it's a 1 to 2 option or a 1 to 3 option. And the others are 0 to 2 because they are not mandatory. You don't have to have them, but you have the flexibility to take them in your list. Now, during the pre-release information that we've got before 9th edition, and 9th edition will be out about 2 days after I've made this video, we'll see some more of these particular missions, but there are specific combat patrol missions. So when you're building your list, take a look at some of these missions and see if any of your units will be useful at taking or denying your opponent some of these victory conditions. So for example, this one that Games Workshop shared with us, Incisive Attack, is the one we've seen. There are going to be some others, but it's worth taking a look at when you construct your army. Now, before we jump into my specific lists, there are a couple that Games Workshop shared with us, made from purely the Indomitus new box set that is due out this weekend. So this gives you an idea of what you might be trying to construct to try and face. Now, this Games Workshop are not necessarily the best at making their own lists because and they've limited themselves purely to Indomitus with both a Space Marine force and a Necron force. But this gives you an idea of what you might have to try and deal with when you construct your list. Especially if you're brand new to the game, this is a good start, right? So you can see here they've got a Primaris Lieutenant, 5 Assault Intercessors, Blade Guard Ancient, 3 Blade Guard Veterans and 3 Outriders. We also know those Outriders are Toughness 5, and I believe they have 4 wounds. So that is a very fast, very powerful a multi-wound type unit that we need to kind of consider to deal with, as well as the combat monsters of the Blade Guard Veterans with those Storm Shields. So we need to be able to potentially deal with invulnerable saves, as well as a little bit of melee with those Assault Intercessors. On the flip side though, the Necron force is a bit more close combat orientated, but with some stalwarts to take those objectives in the form of those Necron warriors. The Scorpek Destroyers and Scorpek Lord are beasts in combat, so we kind of need to be able to mix and match our forces to kind of deal with a mix of game types. So with all the objective-based stuff, board control is quite important. Taking objectives and remaining with the ability to take those objectives is quite tough. So objective secured units are pretty key going into 9th edition, no matter what level of game size you're playing. But again, this gives you an idea of what can be made out of the Indomitus Necrons, and probably something vaguely similar like this might be seen across the battlefield from any random pickup games or friends that you might be playing against. But yeah, some interesting choices there. You see there's quite a lot of infantry in this list with their reanimation protocols. Could be quite difficult to shift. And then you're still going to be worried about those Scorpek Destroyers and Lord rushing your lines and getting into combat. Again, multi-wound, high toughness stuff that you need to try and be able to deal with your own combat patrol. So let's take a look at this example Thousand Suns list that I've come up with then. So leading my force is an Exalted Sorcerer on disc. He is confidently backed up by an Elite's Choice, which is my Zangor Shaman. I then have 2 squads of Rubric Marines, both at 5 man each. So pretty cheap, minimum size unit. I have a squad of 10 Zangor, and then I found myself with a few points left over and went with a Chaos Spawn, just for the random giggle factor and something a bit more interesting to take. And 23 points is going to get you maybe a couple more Zangors, right? So yeah, that's probably the only real option here, is to drop the Spawn and take more Zangors, or even drop the Shaman and max out that unit of Zangors to something around 20. The reason I'm looking at this type of list though, right, so I'll cover the magic options and the powers and everything else just at the end of this little section. Minimum squad units for the rubrics is to mitigate against potential blast weapons that you might find. Anything over 6 models, you could find yourself taking more hits than you plan to, but they are quite resilient on their own. There's no upgrades in this unit. We do have those aspiring sorcerers for psychic powers. We do have those AP-2 range 24 bolt guns, but with the All is Dust rule and that 5+ invulnerable save, they are still pretty hard to shift. Certainly at this size of squad, with the new terrain rules and facing only 500 points of opposition. So we can only take a maximum of 3 troops, and that's exactly what I've done, specifically for the objective secured rules to take those objectives in the mission itself. The Zangor Shaman then I've taken because I have a unit of Zangor. He gives them a good buff, he makes them a a 2+ to hit in combat. Keeping them nearby the Exalted Sorcerer also means that they will be re-rolling 1s because they are Heretic Astartes. And with some relatively cool buffs, like Veterans of the Long War, they are +1 to wound as well. I feel that combination is going to be pretty good, especially against that example Indomitus force, for example, with those Toughness 5 multi-wound bikes. Taking out some of the more powerful characters and some of the other multi-wound stuff, Strength 4 bolt guns, even with -2, you're not going to get a lot of wounds through, but what you do get through may chip off a couple of wounds. But the key here is Smite and other psychic powers that cause mortal wounds. So with our +6 range on Smite, and so very few enemy models, we should be in a good position to be able to pick and choose our targets quite well, especially when they're on disc and we have that maneuverability to make sure that these guys are going to be the nearest target to our Smites or to any other powers that we're going to be casting. So for me, that is pretty good. The Shaman at 85 points is a great little Smite stick for that. Plus he gets an automatic reroll on any first power that he uses during a game. So if you're trying to guarantee a power, he's probably one to be casting it. We also have the Baby Smites or other options available on the Aspiring Sorcerers in both Rubric squads as well. So we have 4 casting characters here during that psychic phase. We have the objective secured troops, we have the random factor that might keep people a bit busy with that Chaos Spawn, and we've got some melee experts with our Zangors. And this gives me a pretty good mix and match, and fairly balanced, I would equally argue, force to be taking in combat patrol. So just to run through that list then, you can see that on screen. As you can see, that comes in at 498 points and a power level of 33. Now the recommended size, as I said, is 25. I really struggled to get it to 25 with this army, or with any of the models within the Thousand Suns. But as I said, I believe Games Workshop are going to be rebalancing some of those power levels as we go into 9th edition. So I kind of ignored it and really aimed for that 500 point limit, as I still feel more people are playing to the points than to the power level. So let's discuss the cult and powers then. So my Exalted Sorcerer is obviously going to be my Warlord. I'm choosing Cult of Magic. I do find that to be one of the most effective ones out there, especially for that psychic offense, especially around the mortal wound issuing. So I've actually used all of the abilities from the Cult of Magic. So I've taken Devastating Sorcery, which adds 1 to every mortal wound you do. So your Smite is going to be 1 plus D3, for example. And Arcane Focus is going to give us +1 to cast, which means our Warlord is casting Smite on a 4+. So he takes Smite, he takes Astral Blast, which is free to all Psychers in the Thousand Suns in a cult, and the other abilities I've taken are Glamour of Tzeentch and Death Hex. And the reasons for that, Glamour of Tzeentch is a -1 to hit, which is the most you can negate these days. There's a limit on minuses and pluses to roll when you're doing that kind of thing, so a -1 to hit is going to be quite good. And then Death Hex, as I said, some of those units are rocking invulnerable saves. With +1 to cast, it means Death Hex is cast on a 7 rather than an 8, and we want to try and beat those invulnerable saves off of any opponent's tough Death Star type units that are going to cause us a little bit of trouble when we start shooting at them. If you find that a lot of the tables that you play on have, I believe it's dense cover, which means that you're -1 to hit anyway, you might want to ignore Glamour and take something else, just because the terrain functions might give you that benefit and it won't stack. So just depends on the type of terrain and playstyle that you've got when you think about those powers. Let's take a look then at the Aspiring Sorcerers. As I said, we've got 2 of these, again, still in the Cult of Magic. They both come with Smite and Astral Blast as part of the Cult of Magic. And then I've given one Weaver of Fates and the other one Tzeentch's Firestorm. Both reasonably achievable at a warp charge of 6 and 7 respectively. Weaver giving us +1 to our invulnerable save, and Tzeentch's Firestorm is another way of issuing out mortal wounds to the enemy. And again, as I mentioned, if you're facing some of those tougher units, some of the only ways that we've really got of dealing with it is with mortal wounds. And if, like, Drakari are bringing some small light vehicles, for example, that are toughness 6 on the most part, pretty quick and pretty nifty, don't carry a lot of wounds with them though, and we're going to struggle to wound them with any of our ranged weapons. Being able to weaken them quite substantially with some Smite is probably our most suitable offense when it comes to those tough units. Finally then, our Zangor Shaman, who doesn't get any cult abilities, so he carries Smite with him, and he can pick one other power, and I've gone with Doombolt. Again, another way of issuing mortal wounds, and I just feel with his free reroll, Doombolt is actually a slightly higher ability to be able to cast at a warp charge value of 9, but it also affects enemies in their movement phases and stops enemies advancing. So even with a warp charge of 9, with a reroll for free in the first turn that you use it, I think that's probably a good option for him. On the most part though, he will probably be casting Smite, but this just gives you that bit of tactical flexibility. Just a quick word on command point spending on stratagems then. So we only got 3 to start with, but we do gain 1 per command phase. Risen Rubrique is definitely a good one. This allows us to set up a rubric squad 9 inches from the enemy deployment zone. That can really force the enemy's agenda a little bit. Adepts of the Immaterium to be able to ignore perils of the warp, given that we don't want our Warlord to die or any of our Psykers really to die. Being able to ignore that on a CP is invaluable. There's always good old Veterans of the Long War for that +1 to wound, which is always very handy against high toughness opponents. And then finally the potential for Sorceress Infusion, where we can get some Rubric Marines back if the psychic power within that unit was 9 or higher. Again, a bit situational, but getting models back at this kind of points level could be the difference between winning and losing quite heavily. So if you've got the ability to bring stuff back, just like the Necrons do for free, it's going to cost us a CP, but well worth thinking about when you're casting those powers. So we're now going to take a look at an incursion size force, and just as a quick reminder then, this is a game that's supposed to take around 2 hours, whereas the combat patrol was 1 hour. Basically, we're doubling our number of points, and therefore the game's going to take double the amount of time. And again, just as a quick reminder, an incursion force is between 501 and 1,000 points, and we get 6 command points to start the game. This time we have access to 2 potential detachments though, but I highly recommend sticking with the 1 because those detachments are going to cost you a serious amount of CP, and we only start with 6. So I'm going to stick with 1 in my example. And in my example army, the one I'm going to be going for is a battalion detachment. So yeah, my Warlord is going to be part of it because it's the only detachment I'm taking. And as you can see, there is a various number of different options that we've got compared to the patrol detachment. We have a mandatory 2 HQs, we have a mandatory 3 troops, but we can take up to 3 HQs, up to 6 troops, and then we can take up to 6 elites, 3 fast attack, 3 heavy support, and 2 flyers. For me though, this is a great way as part of a slow grow, building a new army, or participating with friends on a slow grow, where you're buying an army to a particular points limit, and then you want to extend into the next points value of game. So if you've already built and painted 500 points for playing that combat patrol, getting used to 9th edition, you now want to add a second unit of 500 points, or a second lot of models for 500 points, add that to your combat patrol, and then be able to play the next level of game. And that's vaguely what I've done here. I have added to my combat patrol, but I have dropped a unit to be able to do so, and we'll take a look at that next. So this army then builds on my combat patrol at the cost of my chaos spawn. So what I've done is kept the original Exalted Sorcerers, the 2 5-man units of Rubrics, the 10 squad of Zangors, and what I've done here, and in fact I've kept the Zangor Shaman as well, what I've done here is added 10 Cultists, a second Exalted Sorcerer on disc, 5 Scarab Occult Terminators from the Elite slot, and a heavy support choice in the form of a Forge Fiend with 2 Hades Cannons. Now there are a few tactical options you could make here if you don't have the Forge Fiend, for example. The Defiler is another very good option, or even a Hellbrute or a Contemptor Dreadnought if that is your fancy. I really like the Forge Fiend, but I am being swayed by Defiler choices. If I saw the comment section in my last video, I think there's a very valid choice for that. But the Forge Fiend over the Defiler basically is because it's got a more guaranteed damage output, because the Defiler is a bit more variable. But that said, both are highly valuable, I think, in a Thousand Suns list. And at 1,000 points, I think this is I'm going for a very well-rounded type of army, a bit of a take on all comers. So I've still got my objective secured troops. I've now got that additional one in the form of cultists, which can act as a potential screen, or depending on the type of layout of the game that we're playing, could just sit at the back and hold an objective for me, allowing some of my other troops to be in a bit more offensive positions. The Scarab Occult offer that little bit of extra firepower. They have a Soul Reaper cannon and a Hellfire rack in there, which means that we've got a bit of extra anti-personnel punch. We also carry those 2 Hellfire missiles, which means we've got an added bit of anti-armor alongside that Forge Fiend. Plus, with the fact that the Scarabs can deep strike without the cost of a command point like coming in from reserves, because they operate from the Teleportarium. We have an extra Psyker in the fact that we have another Aspiring Sorcerer with those guys there, which means that we've now increased our Psychic offense by 2 more Psykers. And then going with that Forge Fiend for that anti-Primaris factor, right? It dishes out 2 damage weapons, 8 shots, can be easily buffed by various characters, with monsters and vehicles now not suffering the -1 to hit when they move, becomes a little bit more mobile than previously used, whereas if you had to move it before, it then became 5s to hit. It was a bit of a nightmare. There's some great stratagems to allow you to reroll all hits and wounds with him. With the Aspiring Sorcerers, or the Exalted Sorcerers, sorry, to give those rerolls to 1. This guy becomes pretty good at hitting, pretty good at wounding. We've got 6 command points to play with. Using them on him is certainly a very valid option, especially to take out some of those little bits of armor that are going to start creeping in to your opponent's list, and maybe some more troops that you want to thin the ranks with something like him. At this point from the Combat Patrol, though, we've already got most of the psychic powers already covered. I'm sticking with the Cult of Magic for this, just because of that Astral Blast, and the Warlord trait is pretty effective. Getting out those mortal wounds against your opponents when we don't have too much in the way of shooting range, I think is a very valuable thing to have, and it kind of puts the opponents off a lot. We don't have that Overwatch spam that we might have done before, putting in Warp Flamers into squads to really put off people charging, because Overwatch now costs you a command point, so you now have to be very careful with it. I think this, again, is another nicely well-rounded list that should be able to deal with most all-comers. So just as a quick recap, this was my Combat Patrol. We are going to be taking out the Chaos Spawn, and then we're adding in that Exalted Sorcerer, the 10 Cultists, the 5 Scarab Occult with the Soul Reaper and Hellfire Rack, and the Forge Fiend with the Hades Cannons. That comes in at 997 points, or a power level of 64. Again, I'm kind of ignoring the power levels. I am going more for the points value here, as I feel that is what's more common. But again, if you don't have a Forge Fiend and you want to run a Defiler, I think there's just 5 points difference in it, so you can easily find those extra 2 that you might want to be able to field something like that. Or again, Contemptors or Hellbrutes, something with that big anti-tank or reliable damage kind of weapon to take out the opponent's armor or super tough troops that you're going to start seeing appear in the 1000-point games. With Incursion covered then, I'm going to move into Strikeforce. I'm actually going to look at 2 different armies for this. One's a bit silly, and one is going to follow on from our slow grow kind of format. Just a reminder then, a Strikeforce is up to 2,000 points. It's supposed to take around about 3 hours to play. This is probably going to be where most of your games are going to be taking place in. You know, anywhere from 1,500, 1,750 and 2,000 points is quite common. So this fits into this Strikeforce format. So yeah, a couple of examples coming up for you. And just as a reminder then, Strikeforce, we can take up to 3 detachments. The first one I'm going to be doing is just going to be sticking to the 1 detachment because I want to save my command points. And the second one I'll be looking at, the bit more silly one, is taking all 3 detachments. So again, I'm going to be taking a battalion detachment just as we did with the Incursion Force. And here it is. So as you can kind of see, I'm going to go through it anyway. So what we've got is our original Incursion Force. So you can see the Zangors we've got there, the Rubrics we've got there in the centre, the 5 Scarabs, the two. In fact, we've promoted one of our Exalted Sorcerers to Araman. We've also, when I say promoted, he's actually turned into a Demon Prince. He's been elevated into demonhood. So my 3 HQs then is Araman on disc, a Demon Prince with wings with 2 talons, and then the Exalted Sorcerer, who maybe didn't prosper in his career as much as the other fella. I've added some new units to this in the form of 10 more Zangors. I've added 5 more Scarab Occult Terminators. They are bog standard though, just due to the points limitations. I've added some Enlightened with Fatecaster Bows. And then finally a Helldrake. Oh, and additionally 10 more Rubric Marines. I've gone with a 10-man squad. So yeah, so we've increased our troop count by quite substantial numbers, as well as all of our characters and our psychic offense again. So we can just go through this. So as I said, we've got Ahriman on the left, we've got the Winged Demon Prince and the Exalted Sorcerer on disc. Again, when it comes to powers, I'm not going to go through every power because that's going to really come down to personal preference. I would still recommend Cult of Magic, although Ahriman cannot be in that cult as a named character, but all of the other guys can. How you split those powers will probably determine on your playstyle. Things like Diabolic Strength and Warp Time on the Demon Prince are normally pretty effective. Now that the board size has gone up a little bit in size, means that he needs to be a bit more nimble to get around the board and get into combat and smash face. These are my 2 units of Rubric, so these are the original ones still remaining as they are, minimum size unit, 90-point squad, 2 units of 5, then I've also added a unit of 10. Now that is going to be susceptible to a minimum blast number, so it will be inflicting 3 automatic hits, my blast, or minimum 3, automatic rolling on the dice rather than the potential getting a 1. But we can take advantage of the fact that they've got really good saves and you can put them in cover, and it makes them far more difficult to get off an objective when there is a larger number of them. I've added that second unit of Scarab Occult Terminators, so the first unit on the left remains as is, Soul Reaper and Hellfire Rack. On the right hand side, just down to points limitations, they are all Storm Combi Bolters, Inferno Combi Bolters and Power Weapons. But again, we are adding yet another Aspiring Sorcerer to our Psychic offense. And then we move into, yeah, this is the unit of 10 I was just talking about. Again, I've gone with a Flamer in this unit, a Warp Flamer and a Soul Reaper cannon. So I'm maxing out on some of the more powerful weapons in here. I think an extra Soul Reaper is not to be sniffed at, especially if this is going to be trying to maybe infiltrated and landed on a central board objective perhaps, or even using Dark Matter Crystal and send them behind the opponent to try and seize their objectives, because there's quite a few missions where you're going to get bonus points for taking opponents' objectives. Sticking these at the back could be a real eye-opener for the opponent. Again, sticking with that Forge Fiend, again, optionally, I would suggest you might want to go with a Defiler or look at the Contemptor Dreadnought options. They are, I believe, all Forge World options for the Contemptors. But a Hellbrute, again, is equally valid in my opinion. Twin Lass Cannons, I think, are pretty common on those. And then finally, I'm going with the Helldrake, because I love the way that I've painted this model. And I'll be, yeah, I kind of like to use it. Again, this is one of those kind of units that you might want to switch out. I still think it's got a bit of a place. I think it's still quite expensive. I think there are like 150 points in 9th edition. But it does give a bit of a scare factor. It's exceptionally quick. With the fact that not everybody could get to Overwatch unless you're facing Tau, it gives him a much better chance to get into combat where some of those attacks are going to work. You can still cast some of the powers on him to give him a bit of a boost when he gets into combat. He still has that Bale Flamer, which isn't a blast weapon, so you are still rolling random number of shots from his Flamer. Although the Hades cannon is now probably viable on him because it's not going to suffer the -1 to hit every time you swoop around the battlefield. So that's a potential still to take. But again, you might want to drop both the Fiend and the Helldrake and double up even on Defilers, for example, or an extra Contemptor. Something like that gives you the options, but as I said, I don't own those, so this kind of fits into my aesthetic. Now, again, potentially questionable, because these did go up quite a lot in points, is my unit of 9 Enlightened with Fatecasters. This is the reason why I take the Shaman still in this list, because I've got a lot of Zangors now appearing, and he gives them that +1 to hit, which means these are still putting out an awful lot of damage in that shooting phase, and we don't have a lot of super good shooting range with fairly cheapish units. So with that Zangor close by, it does make them +1 to hit. We can't keep stacking that, unfortunately, with things like Prescience, which means that they are automatically wounding on a 5+. We can't get that down to 4+ anymore. But they are Strength 5 AP -1 bows. They're not double damage, admittedly, but Strength 5 is better than your standard Inferno bolt gun. So they are far more manoeuvrable. and they can still put out an awful lot of damage, especially with this Shaman nearby. So again, it's an optional unit if you don't have a unit of 9 Zangors enlightened. I really liked painting them, so I like to use them. But that is one of the options that I've got. They are about 180 odd points, I believe. So it does give you flexibility to switch in something that you do have in your collection or you prefer the look of. Finally then, this is the second unit of Zangor. So one unit now has a Brayhorn and the other unit doesn't. So your Brayhorn unit is the one you want to get charging. You could, if you really wanted to, combine this unit into one big blob of 20. They will suffer from the Big Blast template effect, but you might want to hold them in reserve or dark matter crystal them, or something to keep them off the board from being hit by multiple blast weapons. They are more troops though, and troops in 9th edition, well, certainly controlling objectives in 9th edition is very important, but it does give us that added melee factor. Yeah, I love Zangors, let's be honest. I think most Thousand Sons players love a good Zangor, so I wanted to add in a second unit. So this is the list then, if you want to press pause and have a good read, but basically it's Ahriman on disc, a Demon Prince with wings, Exalted Sorcerer on disc, a 10-man unit of Rubrics with Soul Reaper and Warp Flamer, 2 5-man units, 2 10-man Zangor units with a Brayhorn, Zangor Shaman, 5 Scarab Occult with the Soul Reaper and Hellfire Rack, 5 Scarab Plain, 9 Zangor Enlightened with the Fatecaster Bows, a Forge Fiend Helldrake, and that comes in at 1,999 points. I've not bothered to calculate the power level because at this point I think most people are not playing power level at all. And now for another alternative 2,000 point list that's maybe a little bit more silly. And this one allows us to take Magnus the Red, our beloved Demon Primarch. So in order to take him, we need to take a Supreme Command Detachment, which costs us 0 points, but he has to be our Warlord. I've then taken a Battalion. Now, a Battalion would normally cost us 3 command points, but being a Demon Primarch in that Supreme Command refunds that for us. And then I've taken a Combat Patrol, or a Patrol Detachment, on the right-hand side of this picture. This list contains all of the most powerful Psykers in the Thousand Sons arsenal. In fact, there are 10 Psykers in this list. So if we kind of go through what we've got 3 squads of Rubric Marines, all bog standard, no upgrades at all, minimum size unit, 90 points each. Then got one very large blob of 20 Zangor. And then for the HQs in that unit, 3 Demon Princes, 2 with Talons, 1 with an Axe because I wanted some variety. And I've also added in then the Mutilith Vortex Beast because we've got a lot of Zangors. Mutiliths are great at buffing Zangor units with some of their powers. So that kind of fulfills all of the requirements for the battalion. I then have a Combat Patrol. Now, the Patrol Detachment. Now, Zangors don't get any of our cult abilities, so I've kind of shoehorned in units into the Patrol Detachment that don't really care about that kind of thing. So what I've taken is Ahriman on disc. I've taken the Shaman again. I've taken the Chaos Cultists. I've got 1 Exalted Sorcerer in there who would come under the ability of a cult. But I just put him in there anyway just to get the extra offensive psychic powers. And then this time I've gone with the Enlightened with the Divining Spears for some close combat punch. So as you can tell, this is just a little bit of fun. This is psychic bonkers list. Be prepared to use that command point to stop getting perils. There is a lot of psychic offense in here. You can run pretty much every power there is in the book. With the Demon Princes, we've now got access to the Discipline of Change, for example, which we don't have with the others. So we can get that free reroll, for example. There's a good couple of powers in there. We can run some boons, and we can slingshot Magnus right up the board with Warp Time, or hold him in reserve, spend some CP, because we've now got plenty of CP to worry about. Although our patrol does cost us 2, so officially we start with just 10 command points with this by buying that extra detachment. But yeah, I think it's a little bit interesting. It's a little bit more fun. 3 Demon Princes, Magnus and Ahriman are just going to ruin people's days. But you are playing 2,000 points. You're going to see some interesting lists out there at 2,000 points. So why not come up with something a bit more fun? And that's what I've done with this. So this doesn't really go with that slow grow format. Again, this is just using some of the units I've got to make something a bit more bananas. But going through the rest of the list though, I hope you agree that some of that does look like a really good way to slow grow a nice, well-rounded and balanced army. And that's going to kind of wrap this video up, guys. This has been an interesting video to make. I appreciate it is quite long. It's like nearly 35 minutes. If you're still with me, well done for surviving that long. If you're brand new to Warhammer 40k and looking to collect Thousand Suns, there's some good Facebook groups out there, or my channel, of course, with some good advice, I believe. But let me know in the comment section what you think of some of these armies that I've come up with for the new edition of 9th. This is all based off of all the new points that we were leaked a few weeks ago now, a couple of weeks ago now. We will have full official access to all those points come this weekend. And I'd love to hear from you on some of those, some of your thoughts. Are some of these units not really viable? You notice I haven't taken my Decimator engines. I think Forge World are going up rapidly in points. And I've got a funny feeling they might not see the table this edition. Who knows? But on the whole, I do feel that some of these are great examples of some well-balanced lists. They're not too extreme other than that final one, which is just a bit of fun. But I'd love to know, as I said, in the comment section what you think. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I shall catch you guys on the next video.